right, ladies and gentlemen, it's 5:30. We'll just give it a minute and then we'll get rolling with our webinar. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Rob Butters. I'm with Discadis Consulting, and this evening I've got Jerry Morin with me to talk about risk management, specifically looking at something called Have You Checked Your Blind Spot? Looking at risk management specific to nonprofit organizations. Again, this is brought to you by Discadis, SEGO, and sponsored by the Assemblée de la Francophonie de l'Ontario. So we thank them very much. So what we've got this evening, we have our chat enabled if there's any questions that come up along the way. And we've also got a tool, a risk register tool that's going to come later on in the program that you'll be able to take away with you as a Google Doc to help you to use within your work and your area as a bit of a takeaway. So again, feel free to use the chat or the Q&R at any time. And I'm going to pass it over to Jerry to get us going on risk management in nonprofits. Jerry?
Thanks very much, Rob. Hello, everyone. Good evening. The way we'll proceed is please feel free to use a Q&A. Rob's mentioned it, but just so that if ever we go through information that you have questions about, raise your hand that way, and then we can address any topics you want us to cover a little bit more or clarify, certainly. So the first section will be more of some theory around risk management and risk management process and program. Then we'll look at some scenarios that are specific to nonprofits, which is today's topic. Then we'll get into an exercise, as Rob said, and then we'll close off. But again, feel free to raise your hand through the Q&A or through the chat, and we'll cover items that you need clarification on. So we'll start with what's risk management, and then I think the first point is really to define what risk is, because really a risk is a threat that might impede your organization's ability to deliver on its objectives, on its strategy. So an obstacle, a threat. So if we start with that, then risk management is really looking at how can we manage that, how can we influence this risk downward and then to be at an acceptable level. So really the risk management process is identifying, evaluating the risk. Then once they're identified and evaluated, then we can prioritize them and address them through mitigating actions. So and then we monitor, and the wheel keeps turning on an annual basis, more or less, between the management team and the board, and looking at those. So really, that in essence, that's what risk management and risk management process is. And then as far as nonprofits are concerned, there's a whole slew of different risks. We listed a few here, whether they're legal and regulatory, whether they're financial related. They can be part of your daily operations, or reputational, which is a very sensitive one as well. But we'll look at some specifics a little bit later on. So the basic steps, the main steps in a risk management program. This is what we're looking at in the next few slides. So first off, as I said earlier, the first step is really to identify risk. Really, what keeps you up at night? Really trying to put your finger on those obstacles, those threats that might come up, that might materialize, that would affect your business. And there's all sorts of categories, and we've listed a few key ones that apply to nonprofits, or that really we see in nonprofit organizations. The first one being governance. Governance being really the board's oversight of the organization. So looking at the board responsibilities, if there's issues around that, there might be a disconnect within the board, between board members, that it would affect decision-making and the direction given. There could be an issue with the compliance with the bylaws that have been adopted. And it could be an issue with the legal side of things and the fiduciary duties of the board and the diligence they had to conduct and the way they act for the organizations as opposed to for themselves. So really, governance is an area where there could be different types of risks. Then we've got financial risks, different types. It could be fraud, embezzlement. Those are common ones we hear in the news too often. A lack of internal controls is one thing. To really have the proper policies and processes in place to control and manage the organization properly. There could be a compliance to grant terms and conditions, for example. That could be a risk if you don't comply to the conditions set by your sponsor or your the financing organizations you deal with, and you could lose your grants. And then financial viability, keeping your boat afloat, really not losing money over time and avoiding deficits and keeping a sound financial really situation for your organization.
So Jerry, it could be as simple as another financial risk could be as simple as just losing some of your chief financing or chief sponsors, correct?
Absolutely. That's a direct hit to your financial viability. Absolutely right. Yes. Then we've got legal and regulatory. That's another aspect to look at, with the compliance with all regulations, be it taxes, income taxes, be it your specific sector's legal requirements as far as a nonprofit organization or the sector you're into, or the employment laws that you have to adhere to. So if you don't comply to those, then you put the organization at risk of fines and all sorts of complications with the regulatory authorities. On the operational side, basic service delivery. If you're not delivering on your promises and you're not delivering quality services, then you risk of losing clientele. Or you could have program disruptions, either because of an internal source or external environment that could disrupt your operations. Staff shortages, difficulty to recruit. We get into cybersecurity with your technology and the systems that you use. We all hear about those, again, too often, but those are a risk that you need to consider and determine the extent of them for your organization. Then we get into reputational, which applies to all of us, all your organizations, and very sensitive it is, because if you hit the papers, the newspapers or the media, your reputation might be tainted, and then you could lose business. You could lose confidence from your beneficiaries, your clients. So it could be a PR crisis. It could be a loss, lead to a loss of donor or beneficiary trust. And so that goes a long way in your long-term viability, that trust that you need from your financing organizations. And it could be unethical behavior by staff or volunteers that could lead directly to reputational risk, because word of mouth, social media hit the news very quickly. So those are different types of risks. A short list would give you a sense of what the different risks you could identify. Then the second step of the second key step of the sound risk management process is assessing the risk, really trying to evaluate the risk, and often they're not necessarily financial, so you can't put a number on them. So that's why there's some methods that we use that are standard in the risk management sphere, where you use to evaluate or assess your risk, which are the probability, which is the likelihood of the risk occurring. So what are the chances that this will materialize and affect our organization? And then the other axis is the impact or the severity. Those are synonyms. Like, to what extent, how much would it hurt? What level of damage would we suffer? What are the financial, legal, or reputational? And those two scales, the probability and the impact, can range. You could have a scale that ranges from low probability, low impact. It could be reasonable or limited probability. Then you can have a very high probability of occurrence. The same for the impact, from low to catastrophic, for example, as far as an impact scale. So once, for each risk you've identified, once you've used your judgment, you've used the information that you have, and you can evaluate the probability, you evaluate the impact, then you're able to prioritize the risk and see which risk really are the highest, the most critical ones. And then you prioritize them that way, so you can invest the resources, be it financial or human resources, that you have to mitigate them. So the next slide is where we draw what it would look like once you've assessed a risk. you've got one axis, as you see on the left-hand side, the severity or the impact from minor to major, and then you give a number to the probability, which is the other axis, from very improbable to very probable, then the intersection of those two will situate your risk. So you've now assessed or evaluated your risk, you put it on the map. So now you have the left-hand side, the top right-hand side corner as the unacceptable risk. They're red because they're very probable and they could be a very major impact or a very important impact, as opposed to the lower end, the left-hand side, the bottom left-hand side, which is minor, very improbable, not to lose sleep at night over.
So we want to stay out of the red.
Exactly. Absolutely.
So Jerry, these can over time, I guess they could change, because you can have something that's very probable at one point in time and perhaps really severe to the operation of your nonprofit, and that could change over time as you reassess risks and reevaluate risks. Is that usually the case?
Absolutely. You've hit the nail right on the head, which is the next step of the process, is where once we've prioritized the risks, then we start working on them with mitigating actions. And that's a whole purpose of the risk management process, is to manage them downwards so that they come back to a manageable or acceptable level out of the red. Absolutely. So on the next slide, we get into that next phase of the process. And thank you for the preamble, Rob.
In other words, we'll always have risk. It's just to reduce it. That's really the purpose of this risk management process.
Right. And the key word you've used is decrease them, manage them, but you can't necessarily bring them to zero.
No.
If you eliminate the risk, you might have spent too much effort, because we all live and operate with a minimum risk. It's really depending on your management team and your board, what they can tolerate, what they find as acceptable, and they determine the actions that we're about to talk about accordingly so that they can manage it to an acceptable level.
Okay.
Thank you. And that's where the next step is. That's what it is, mitigating risk, where for each of those top risks, the critical risks you've identified that are in the red zone to start with, then for each risk, you can assign action plans to reduce that risk, reduce that impact, or reduce that probability. And here are some examples on the next two slides, this one and the next, where we list examples of mitigating actions. One being, if you've got clear, you may not have for all the sectors or for the risks that are identified, but having clear policies on governance, or on financial management, or on HR, depending on where your risks reside or what's not covered. The policies direct employees. They frame our ways of acting within the organization. So it is a basic, but it is a very important type of mitigating action. And then the next one, it can be regular training for staff, board members, management team, to raise the risk awareness and address some preventative methods. So training, you've got that awareness level that you bring on, depending whether it's fraud, whether it's the risk of cyber attacks. You raise the awareness so you get more protected, because all employees are more knowledgeable on the topic. Another one is having insurance. We all have insurance, but it might be a sector of the organization or a risk you identified that you're not necessarily covered or covered sufficiently. So getting the adequate, proper insurance coverage for whether it's general liability, whether it's directors and officers, whether it's errors and omissions, or physical property, or workplace accident insurance. So those, by buying insurance, you either reduce or even eliminate the risk for the organization, because you've transferred to the insurance company by paying a small premium respective to the risk. Then another example is the dependence on, if you're dependent on a small or a short list of funders, then you might want to look at diversifying There's all sorts of ways to diversify funding, whether it's fundraising, different types of other grants, donations. So that's to think about. If your funding is high on your list of risks because of that dependence on a single source, then you might want to think about in your strategic plan of going that route as a, again, remediation action. Another one, if you're dealing with some technology risk that you feel, then getting into more robust protection practices, security on your systems to prevent or protect you from cyber attacks or data breaches. And then the last example we have is having a discipline of regularly reviewing your compliance with the laws that you have to adhere to and the regulations of your sector. So having that exercise, a checklist of some sort to go through and periodically reviewing, whether it's quarterly or annually, between the management team and the board, ensure that you're on side with your regulations. Again, that's an action plan. That's one type of mitigating actions if that was a risk that you've identified in your exercise.
Jerry, I just had a question on the financial risks, I guess, and mitigating some of them. I mean, where would cash flow fit? Because I know that's a problem often for non-for-profits, is they can have low cash flow, or sometimes they're even a single source type of funding, and even that single source funding could change over time. But what's the importance, and can we mitigate? How do we mitigate against cash flow? In
Falling cash flow, you mean having a
yeah.
One way could be adopting a performance indicator and looking at your cash, the level of liquidity that you have in the organization, and monitoring that and reporting that part of maybe the ED's report to the board or to the finance committee, and having one or two indicators around cash flow to monitor, so that you can see a trend line. So your
ratios, like, okay,
the trend.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then the last main step is the monitoring and the reassessment, the review mechanism. And that is where, at this point, you create what we call a risk management chart, and we'll look at an example later with Rob, a later slide. But at this stage, just looking at the last step of the risk management process, you create a chart where you list your risks, you list the evaluation level, the severity level of the risk. Then to each you attach the risk mitigation actions that we've just talked about. But the important part is the accountability. You assign those actions to an individual. If you want it done, you have to assign it to someone, and so that accountability is very important. And then you also have a target date for the action, so that it's not lost. And then once it's on there, then you start having a risk management chart, or a risk register, some call it. So you've documented your risks and the actions and the accountability. Then that table is updated and goes through possibly at your finance committee meeting. And we'll touch on that on the next slide. But you have that tool with the heat map and the risk management chart. You've got your action plans. So you got a full report that you can look at periodically. And again, we'll look at that in a few slides with Rob.
And you can make that specific to your own organization.
Absolutely.
Which is key. Yeah. I think it's not like a cookie cutter, right? You adapt it to your own organization.
That's right. The example we'll give it's populated with all sorts of examples. You can add to it, but you can also adapt, because it's not necessarily a high risk for your place. So it's very important to adapt it.
Thank you.
So the monitoring, the last step is really embedding it in your calendar, your governance calendar. So it should be assigned to a committee if you have those in your organization, a committee of the board. Typically, the finance committee deals with the risk management aspect. So if it's on the calendar, then you bring it to the meeting, that risk management chart or that risk register, every quarter. The finance committee looks at it, ensures that the actions are progressing, and also takes a look at the risks and make sure that they're still applicable, they haven't changed because of the external or internal environment. So you kind of have a good look every quarter, and then annually you bring it to the board again, and you reassess the risk. You refresh it, you update the action plans, and the board can look at it and approve it, and it's part of its due diligence over risk management. So that's basically, those were the steps, the 4 key steps of the risk management program. Now what we'll do is we'll jump in some specific scenarios and what we call blind spots, which are the risks that could catch you off guard. And those are what we've done. We've done an exercise of trying to really identify the main blind spots, the main risks that are typical for nonprofit organizations. So the 4 categories that we identified that we see coming up, I'd say too often, is about an HR crisis, something, and we'll deal with the specifics of each in the next few slides. But the HR crisis, the financial insolvency, the financial difficulties of the organization, incidents of affecting operations, day-to-day operations, which could be significant, and then reputational damage, which is the last but not least, again, very sensitive. Another very important blind spot for nonprofits. So the first one to look at, the first scenario is HR crises, and we've listed 3 scenarios here. First off, and the one that comes to mind often, is the loss of the ED, the loss of the executive director. We're in trouble if the person was to fall ill or decide to leave the organization. We're in trouble. But we have to think beyond that too, because depending on your organization, it could be the executive director, but there could be also a high risk if a key individual in the organization leaves. And it could be the person in accounting, it could be the head of operations, the manager of operations in your organization, somebody that's key that you determine that if they leave, we're definitely set it back and for a while. So identifying that risk is very important. Then when you get into the actions, or how do you proactively mitigate that, then you can start thinking about maybe preparing a kit for emergency recruitment. You could train the second in command for that position to have a person ready to step in case, if you identify that as a key risk in your organization, there's different ways you can counter that or reduce that risk.
You'd head into that whole succession planning piece that we talk about.
Yes.
Yeah, I know. Just the other day we were talking about this, Jerry, and one of the examples we came up with, which I found was interesting, and one of the organizations I used to work with, one of the key people was somebody in payroll. And if anything had happened to that particular individual, then people weren't going to get paid, which could be a challenge to the organization. So, you see those key points too. It's not always just the executive director. And I guess it'll depend on scale too. A small nonprofit that might only have 1 employee, like the ED, but then a larger non-for-profit, there might be a whole C-suite of individuals that could be working. So I guess it all depends on scale as well.
Because your operations start with your employees. If you've got disgruntled employees that haven't gotten paid for a few days, it's not going well. So you're right on that one. So it could be your payroll person. So again, it's really from organization to organization, identifying whether that's a risk and which area, which individual could be a key.
I guess personalities too, for certain charities and non-profit, if they have these, I don't know, I think of athletes and such that are part of the organization, and then all of a sudden if they're not there anymore, it could influence the future direction or something. Anyway.
Yes. Yep. So it's not a cookie cutter. It's not just the ED necessarily. So you have to look at beyond to ensure that you cover that risk. And another scenario is if an employee comes up with a legal action or lawsuit against the organization. It could be a disgruntled employee because they feel they're being treated unfairly, or that the company is not following its policies towards employees. So they react and they trigger a lawsuit. So that also could make its way to other employees in the organization, and it could grow into being quite the HR crisis. So
hurt the productivity for sure and the morale.
Oh, yes. All right. Directly. And so one way you could, um, uh, one way to mitigate that is you could think about assembling an employee handbook, really for employees to clarify the policies and be clear for everybody. You could have some employee training on the actual specific um, area which you feel you might be at risk of employee dissatisfaction. Could be compensation, could be different aspects of the HR world. But again, employee awareness is always important.
I guess a solid or a comprehensive employee evaluation sort of and growth program would also be helpful too, I guess,
Yeah,
for employees.
by formalizing that process of really taking care of your employees to that point and the full cycle during the year. Yes, so all these things is things to think about too that could mitigate and be proactive and avoid some of that some of those risks. The last scenario being just I call it simply, but very challenging for our organization, especially with the lack of resources we feel in the world today, difficulty in recruiting, but recruiting qualified personnel. If you've got if you've got specific sections of your organization, accounting included, for example, and you can't recruit somebody you can that are qualified and you can trust, then you may be in trouble. So one way to counter that, or one way to really mitigate that risk, could be promoting the brand of your organization in the world through social media or otherwise to make your organization appealing. That would be one way. The use of recruitment agencies and really have partnerships with recruitment agency. Also, there's a price to pay, but maybe much smaller than having a vacant position, a critical position vacant for a while. So again, other types of actions. Yes, Ron.
If I can maybe share an example, like Jerry, as you know, I come from the education background, from public education. And I know in Canada, we have a big challenge in hiring and finding qualified teachers because of the increase in the retirement, and because, people moving all over the country, and it's hard to retain the workforce. And I know in Quebec alone, the stats that I saw most recently, like in 2023, there's something like 8,500 staff members short, teachers, between part-time and full-time teachers short. And, that's a concern because they're having to use teachers who aren't fully qualified or yet in the classroom, and that's creating some problems on its own. So to mitigate that, what's had to happen is to, I guess, to pressure and to collaborate with the universities and higher learning to try and get more teachers trained in the programs, but also, as you mentioned before, recruiting, like actually trying to find international teachers to come here to Canada to teach, etc. And that's a big one just from the public education area. So I imagine it's when you start to dig into the specific types of businesses or types of nonprofits, they all come up with their own unique examples. That's the one that I keep thinking about.
And that's definitely a system-wide one for that sector, that sector of the, yeah. So it's a, yes, very challenging. So again, having identifying those is the first step. Once you've identified that concern, that threat, then you can put. It's not easy and doesn't happen from one day to the next. But if you lay it down and you lay a plan, at least you're making your way towards bringing that risk down.
Yeah, and I guess they could be compounded too. I mean, you'd have something like a shortage of finding personnel, and then you get a funding crisis at the same time, or budget cuts, or so that's how they can shift around that heat map a little bit different, I guess.
And then you get all that can compound into reputational.
Yeah, there you go.
Yes. So it's yeah. So having a discipline around risk management, at least laying plans and bringing them down one by one, then you're going the right direction as opposed to letting yourself drown over time. Thank you. Thanks again, Rob. The second area of financial insolvency, again, a few scenarios that we've come up with affecting nonprofits. The departure of a major sponsor, which is obvious because if there's that dependency, as we've talked about earlier, on a major sponsor, or the second one being a major recurring grant, or losing a few recurring grants, then your funding is at risk, and your basic survival can get to that level that you can't operate anymore. So for that, then you have to, if you identify that as applying to your organization, then you have to start thinking about diversifying your sources of funding. And I mentioned earlier quickly, either through other grants or different types of grants, um, identifying other sponsors, donation programs, fundraising campaigns, whatever could apply to your organization. You have to, again, start thinking about it if you identify that as applying to yours. You could also, another action could be solidifying or improving the relations with your existing sources of revenue, your existing sponsors, to make sure that it's tight, it's healthy, and that relationship is solid. So you can maintain that relationship, maintain that funding. The last one on that page of fraud embezzlement on the financial side. Of course, there's instances that hit the papers that are nightmares. Organizations that never expected it, but you've got disgruntled people or people with ulterior motives that come in and benefit from maybe some I guess controls in the organization that are not where they should be, and then the organization loses, and it's sometimes it's significant. I mean, countering fraud is difficult because sometimes it's collusion, sometimes it's. But one thing is actions you have to show your diligence as a board member or as a management team member. You do what you can, and if you identify that as a risk, as a high risk, then evaluating your financial internal controls, having maybe an external party looking at it, and reinforcing them. For example, segregation of duties or approval processes. There are some key steps that can be taken and formalized through policy and practice that can prevent the ability for fraud. You can also have a whistleblowing policy, because within the organization, and if somebody suspects or sees something that looks odd, then you have it reported through a anonymous mechanism, and it can be stopped before it happens. Because often there's some hints, and employees are very aware, and when something's off, usually pick up on them. So again, a few examples how you could counter the risk of fraud if that's identified in your organization as
Jerry, you mentioned early on about grants and reoccurring grants, et cetera. And I mean, to what extent, can nonprofits, I guess, do a better job at writing grants and getting grants? Is that another mitigation that could be done as well to I guess, improve how you write the grants and who you write them to, those types of things? Like, are there experts out there that can help you write grants?
Yes, there are. And actually, I think it's funny you say that, because I think this morning there was a webinar by Discitus with Luc Comeau, who's an expert
Yes. Okay.
in
Yes.
that field. So it's funny you say that, because the timing is there. But yes, there are some experts. There's some help out there. There's some time and effort to put in that to create a mechanism to submit applications for grant and keep it flowing, because the more submissions you send, the more the odds is you'll get more of those grants. But yes, that's why it is. And it wouldn't necessarily be simple or straightforward, but it's out there. And if you identify it as a risk for your organization, you must put it on the list to explore it and determine whether there's some missed opportunities. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm. The next sphere that we talked about, the next, I guess the third blind spot is operational incidents. Really in your day-to-day, facing threats, facing incidents that could be detrimental or significant to your operations. The first example, the first scenario we list is data loss. And data loss could be, we always think malicious. We also always think, or often think, about hackers, but data loss could be accidental. an employee could, unfortunately, delete part of a database by mistake. And if you lose that data, whether it's employee data or client data, could be very, very hurtful. So data loss is one that you have to think about. And it's often, it's happened for nonprofits, and it should be considered. And actions around data loss to again, proactively mitigate or prevent. There's that regular data backup of your database. I mean, that should be in your practices if it's identified. Again, if you feel that's an area of risk. Training, awareness training for your personnel, whether it's training around cyber attacks, around phishing, around all these types of methods that hackers try to invade, and you get an email and you click on the link, think it's legit, and then they get into your systems. That's the malicious side. But again, there's some actions you can take to prevent that, that kind of scenario affecting you.
Yeah.
The other, yes, Rob?
Yeah, I know of a few of those. I mean, especially in the last couple of years, as we've worked more towards people, working at a distance, working from home, getting into the main systems of the work systems from home and those types of things. And I know they created different modules and courses that you have to take and pass, so you're considered to be a digitally safe type of thing. And in fact, I know of some organizations that if you don't take the different modules of the course, you're not allowed to work, for example, on a work computer at home or something like that, because it's reducing the risk that way. And I know you mentioned before the accidental piece. I mean, I'm aware of a school board I worked with a number of years ago. We were migrating to a new communications platform, and we lost all of our data. So it was good in one sense. We had no choice but to move to the new platform right away. But we did it under a great amount of stress, because it was a literally mistake made at the migration of data step, and it was a human error. It was an accident. It wasn't like hacking or anything malicious.
Yeah, and it is as detrimental, whether it's accidental or malicious. It could hurt the organization as much. Great, thank you for the examples, Rob. Yeah, for sure. The next scenario we have here is under the operational incidents is a theft of major equipment. And in the era we live today, post COVID, and people working virtually and showing up in the office once in a while and not always. So there could be a risk to your physical premises and the equipment that are there if you're not there every day and you don't necessarily monitor or see your equipment every day. So that's another one that could be hurtful. As far as trying to mitigate that, you can reinforce your physical security of the location you work at, surveillance systems, etc. But there's also insurance, and I think that's the one that's the most common. If you identify that as a concern, ensuring that your physical insurance, your theft insurance, is sufficient to cover the equipments you've identified that are critical to your operations. Last but not least, in the scenarios, look at the reputational damage, and that one is so sensitive. Probably the most dangerous for any organization, because our raison d'être is often based on trust of our clientele, of our beneficiaries. And if you lose that, or if your reputation is affected, then it may be very hard to get back to where you were before. So the first scenario here, if you're facing the risk of criminal activity by employee, it could be volunteers, employees, that they decide to vandalize some area that you're having a fair, or you participate in a fair somewhere. But as soon as the employee or the volunteer does something criminal like this, your organization is associated to it because they were acting on your behalf. And then it follows through, and if it hits the papers, then Your organization is responsible for it, whether voluntarily or not, and it can be very, very hurtful. So again, that's one that's key. A couple of ways that you can manage that or again mitigate that. It could be through your recruitment policy, having a very tight reference check, very tight background check, going further than just the references. And really, you could go even to the criminal check, depending on your organization, your business. So that way, you screen ahead of time. You're being proactive and preventing that risk. Another one is a formal code of conduct for employees, so that they are aware. There's zero tolerance for fraud, or zero tolerance for that type of action, or X, Y, and Z action in your organization. So then you put it out there, and you're kind of managing it ahead of time to prevent that.
A good
Another,
communication plan would be good as well. Like I said, when these types of things happen, right, you want to, it's helpful for the organization if you can get ahead of it in communications. But if you don't have a good plan to communicate, then you can get beat up by the media before you have a chance to tell your side of the story, if you know what I mean.
yep. And you beat me to the punch, because yes, the crisis communication plan applies to all three scenarios. Absolutely. And that should be the first one. So thank you for raising it, because that's what I was about to comment on. Anything that you feel could affect your reputation, you have to be ready to be reacting very quickly. It's not proactive, but at least you've got a plan to respond swiftly, efficiently, quickly, and manage a public perception of
Never be in the position where you're saying no comment, right?
No, you've got to be prepared. That's it. And there's some experts out there. And again, you can ally with organizations that are good, solid communication firms that can help you put something together. If you feel that reputational is sensitive enough that you need to have that in your parking lot to be ready to activate if something needs to happen. The next scenario, the derogatory comments from a volunteer, depending if they start making comments about different individuals that they come across. You're associated with it. It's your volunteer. It's your organization. One way to, I guess, possibly prevent that is, again, awareness training to all your personnel, whether it's employees or volunteers, on diversity, on anti-harassment, those types of programs, because very sensitive. But again, if that was to happen, your organization is associated with it, and you can be into a reputational crisis quite quickly if the person decides again to go to the papers, because that organization is saying that about me and about my family, about my community. So very sensitive. The last scenario, client dissatisfaction and word of mouth. If you're not delivering on your promise, if you've got things on your website that you're saying we're doing X, Y, Z, and with that level of quality, and you're not delivering, then it only takes a few clients to start hitting the social media, and you could get into a reputational situation. On that, being proactive, if you feel that's something that's sensitive enough for your organization, get into satisfaction surveys, client satisfaction survey. Then through time, you start monitoring the trends, and you're seeing whether it's deteriorating or some concern, or if it's within acceptable levels. That's one method specific to that scenario. But again, anything hitting your reputation, think about your crisis communication protocol and having something ready to respond with. So those are the scenarios we wanted to cover. Next stop is a short exercise that Rob will lead us through.
Okay. So thank you, Jerry. I'm just going to copy and paste in the chat a link to a Google document somewhere here. Hold on, paste it. Now, if you click on that particular link in the chat, or you can download a copy of that particular chart. And I think I'm going to try and go to it, see if this works.
So Mel, if we go to the next slide and you click on the link, maybe we can show it on the screen if you can.
Yeah.
There you go. Merci.
There we are.
Thank you.
What we have here is a copy of the risk register that Jerry was alluding to a little bit earlier rather. And what we've done is we've also included for this particular organization the probability of something happening, the severity of it, and then the rating, whether it's like in the green, yellow, or red areas. For example, you see the one at the top, this particular organization sees the sudden departure of the executive director as being quite high. So it's a 9, but it's certainly not the highest one for the organization. And then you'd line up next to it, you would actually put out there what some of your mitigation plans would be. Like in this case, they were saying for the sudden departure of the executive director would be a well-defined succession plan, documentation, and internal succession training. And whatever those particular mitigation pieces are, like some of the ones a little bit later on, when they talk about protection and so on, you might have insurance might be some of the mitigation. And then you would keep track of when that was put in place, like the adoption date, and as well, who is responsible for it? Because if you don't have somebody on top of following up the particular mitigation actions and monitoring the risks, then things get left behind. And I know Jerry will be sharing an example with you a little bit later. And all of a sudden, you also want to keep an inventory of when that was revised, when it was last revised. So again, you should be able to make a copy from the chat of that particular link, and then feel free to use it within there's no link in the chat. Let me have a check, try that again. Copy. Oh, did it come? Okay, there it is.
And again, as Rob said, this is a fully populated example, a sample of a risk register, and it has quite a long list of risks. So feel free, because it's a very useful tool that can trigger your thinking around what kind of report do I bring to my committee or to my board, and what should it look like, what it should contain, and also key examples of the mitigation examples. So very useful tool for you to use.
Jerry, is there a specific number of risks that we should be looking at in a particular organization, or is there a few like fundamental ones that must be there, or is this example a pretty good one, or what's your thoughts on that?
It's a very solid example because it's very customized to nonprofits, very much so. And it for most organizations, because nonprofits can be in different sectors, but it's certainly very much applicable to most organizations. What I would say is once you've listed and rated your risks, because we have a limited number of employees in the organization, or because we have limited time available, what I would suggest is once you've done that exercise, then you can resort that list and put all the reds at the top in the order of the rating. You start with the highest, and then you start tackling them one by one. And you don't always get to the greens. You shouldn't necessarily worry about. We've populated it just as a sample for people to know if that's a risk that's high in the organization. Here's the type of actions you can take. But in real life, I would suggest there would be no actions against the green because it's satisfactory. The yellow, you could put actions, but the time frame would be later than the red ones because you really want to address the top ones. So that's the type of, in practical sense, that's how you would approach that kind of a document. And even then, not necessarily present to the board. You can do the exercise, depending who's responsible for it in the organization, do the exercise, but then to the committee and the board, it could be presented only with the yellows and the reds.
Okay.
We need to
That makes
more
sense.
focus, because because you've got a long laundry list, right? And it's not always those that don't keep you up at night. You shouldn't worry about it. You shouldn't spend too much time on it.
Okay, thank you. So again, feel free to use this document as you will. No copyright on that one. Go for it. So back to you, Jerry.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much. So, having talked about the risk management process, the scenarios, so at the end of the day, really what we should highlight are those few essential practices in risk management. Once you've done the exercise, so what's key and critical to keep it alive? And first off, we talked about the accountability, really delegating the mitigating plans. Assign them to an individual, then there's a much better chance to get it done. And by getting those actions done, you reduce your risk. And then the next cycle, you should be seeing it going from red to yellow or decreasing over time. So again, delegation and mitigation plans being the first point we want to raise kind of as a conclusion. The second one being a continuous process, the continuous monitoring of that risk register or that risk management table that we work with. And if you sign it to a committee of the board, then possibly the finance committee, then every quarter you have put it on the calendar. You have it on the agenda. It comes up again. You look at it, refresh it, ensure that the actions are progressing and they're not being ignored or not dealt with. Then the committee can ask the questions in a little bit more in detail. You keep it alive, and it evolves because you can change the actions because they've been done. You can start looking at the risk, whether it's still at that level or not. But really, the formal reassessment, I would suggest possibly annually, which is the third step, a full refresh of the assessment, update of the mitigations, whether new ones should be added depending on the new assessment, which ones are dropped and done, to bring it to the board at that point, for the board really to have a good full picture of the risk universe of its organization, and then adopt or approve that risk register as being fair and representative of the organization. That way, then you ensure evidence of the proper diligence and oversight by the board. So you've got full cycle. And then the cycle starts again in the coming 12 months. The last slide we wanted to cover is really kind of final thoughts. The pitfall. We always like the pitfall, risk, tip, and impact. The pitfall, if you use it with a crock-pot approach, you set it, you forget it, you complete it, you've done a beautiful risk register, you put it on a shelf and it starts gathering dust and nobody looks at it again. What happens? Well, it's that risk on that slide. You lose sight of your threats. First thing you know, those blind spots creep up and you hit with an obstacle that you hadn't prevented, and you expose the organization at risk, expose financially, or expose it to not reaching its goals and objectives for the year or on its strategic plan. The tip to counter that, and again, harping on it again, ensure that continuous risk monitoring to that routine, that calendarizing, that risk register, that risk table, that one committee and then the board annually look at as a matter of cycle. The impact, then you increase your chance of having a sustainable long-term viability for your organization. And you have shown, and you've got evidence again of strong diligence by your management team and your board for that long-term viability of the organization.
Thank you, Jerry. It's again, what gets measured and monitored gets done, right? It's
well said.
As simple as that.
Well said. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm just going to jump in for a second, Jerry, just with a couple of quick comments. First of all, thank you for taking us to that. I don't want to call it the dark side. It's an important side, but so often in non-for-profits, we're always thinking positive and thinking of innovation and all these big things. But if we don't actually take the time to look at those risks, to look in our blind spot, we could get burnt. And you provided us with the tools and some theory and explanation of how we could go about that with our organization. And certainly I think something that we can use right away if we don't already have it in place. So I thank you for that. I know we have here our next webinar is coming up. I don't know, Jerry, did you want to speak on these?
So every second week, webinars by Discitus. The next one being February 3rd, as on the slide. And a very important one, again, how to prevent the board from becoming a distraction to the executive director. And I think many organizations feel that. There's always that fine line. So that's one that's always informative. And it's with Jim Brown, a renowned author and author of The Imperfect Board Member. So again, could be very interesting, will be a very interesting one. And then a couple of weeks after that, I'm new to the board. What do I need to know? So again, I think something very informative for new board members. So stay tuned for that and go on the Discus site and to register for those. They're on the site and again, will be very informative webinars.
Well, thank you again, Jerry. I mean, at the end of the sessions, we usually ask participants to sum up in one word what they felt about today's session. So if you wanted to type that in the chat, we would certainly receive that. But I'll use one word to sum up the session. I thought it was very engaging. So I thank you, Jerry. And thank you, Mel, behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you, Mel.